know some of you are still coming in. Welcome, and welcome to those of you who are joining us online for this discussion on global trade and the importance of accountability in sustainability claims. Climate friendly, green, carbon neutral, net zero. These are all the types of buzzwords that we've become used to hearing as we talk about reducing our impact on the environment. It's become a key issue for many companies and businesses as they respond to the growing demand for sustainably produced goods and services and for the need to align with the Sustainable Development Goals. Regulators, supply chain actors, investors, consumers, they're all demanding that businesses consider sustainability throughout the whole value chain, both upstream and downstream. It's become a key challenge for global trade, affecting both the developed world and developing countries. Companies deemed not to meet the correct criteria face quite considerable reputational and economic losses. And the upshot has been a flood of sustainability claims, some substantiated, some not, but they've caused some confusion in the market and it's fair to say some skepticism among consumers. So with our excellent panel today, we're going to examine the challenges of sustainability reporting, the role of international standards and conformity assessment in building trust and ensuring consistent and credible claims, and the mechanisms that can bring clarity to a rapidly evolving landscape. As ever, there's translation available should you need it through the Interprefy app. And we also have our lovely scriber, Rachel, who is on stage, who is going to be creating amazing images and word art of the comments and statements made throughout the session. And in fact, at the risk of embarrassing Rachel, I wonder if we can just give her a little round of applause because some of her creations have been amazing. Thank you. So let me introduce the panels for today. Sorry, I'm just adjusting this mic so you can all hear me properly. Starting on my left, Professor Peter Draper, Executive Director of the Institute for International Trade at the University of Adelaide. Caroline Utter, Vice Chair of ISO's Committee for Conformity Assessment, CASCO. Eric Wikström, Head of the TBT section at WTO's Trade and Environment Division. And William Gain, Global Lead for Trade Facilitation, Customs Reform and Border Management at the World Bank Group. And the panelists will all be taking questions from the floor and from our online audience. If you are online, just type your question into the Q&A box. I'm sure you all know by now how it works. So let's dive in and talk about the issue. Peter, we hear a lot of sustainability claims, some of those which on closer inspection don't hold up, do they? So why is there a need for accountability in sustainability claims from a trade perspective, and what are the challenges with that?
Yeah, thanks, Shirley. So I would approach this from the standpoint of de-risking trade transactions. So I'm going to come from the trade policy and trade negotiations perspective. I'm not a standards maker myself. But basically, if as an importer, for instance, you don't trust the sustainability claims that are coming from your exporter to your market, that puts sand in the cog, so to speak, and it disrupts the trust in the trade transaction. So therefore we need to, from a trade policy point of view, de-risk those sustainability claims. And there's various instruments that trade policy negotiators in particular can use to do that. So the most obvious one is your traditional suite of free trade agreements. And there are many different kinds of free trade agreements of varying levels of ambition. But the modern trend, the correct trend, is to embed sustainability chapters into trade agreements. Typically, and in the past certainly, these have been cooperative arrangements. So they would provide for standards organizations for both parties to come together, forge a mutual recognition agreement, for example, whereby they mutually agree to recognize each other's standards, and sometimes to bring business organizations together to talk about equivalence of outcomes. So the standards may not be the same, but as long as the outcome is the same, you can recognize each other's standards. So that's one set of modalities. The second and fairly new and emerging set, I would call, they're not quite free trade agreements, but they're cooperative arrangements. So 2 examples of this in the Indo-Pacific region. One is the US-led Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, which some people in the room might have heard of. So that has it's got 4 pillars, basically. Pillar 3 is the clean economy pillar.
Right.
And that basically brings 14 countries together, including Australia, to discuss a range of cooperative instruments that they're forging and various investments behind that to build clean economy trade using various mechanisms, and we can get into some of those. And then the second one that Australia and Singapore have forged recently is the Green Economy Agreement. So it's a very similar kind of instrument. So it's not a traditional free trade agreement at all. It binds both parties to cooperate in building green economy trade and investment between the 2 parties. And that includes how to de-risk these problems that we've focused on.
Does it include monitoring so that that everyone is compliant?
So that is a key question in these trade agreements. So traditionally, your sustainability chapters have not been enforceable. In other words, they're not subject to dispute settlement in the agreement. The EU has started to shift the dial on that, so you're starting to see more enforceability coming into these trade agreements. But it's a tricky balancing act. It's a fairly new frontier. I think it is the direction that we'll have to go. Where you're seeing more enforceability is actually on the unilateral side. So this is the EU, for instance, deciding through various directives, for example, the Sustainable Forestry Directive, where the EU sets its own standards and then says we're going to enforce this through the value chain, and they expect companies to comply.
And we've seen quite a lot of EU legislation.
Yes, so this is an example of what trade policy wonks like me call the Brussels effect in motion, right? So basically the idea, the EU has its common market, the biggest market in the world. If you as a multinational want to do business in the EU, you must set your standard according to the EU standard and then operate that globally. So the EU standard effectively becomes the global standard.
Peter, thank you. I think that probably sets the scene for some of the challenges that you've seen, Caroline, from a developing country perspective, because there are now so many requirements being put on these small-scale producers. Talk us through some of the pressures and the burdens they're facing.
Thank you, Shirley. So before we speak about challenges, I think we must acknowledge as developing country members that we've come from far. And I think we have the pandemic to thank for how far we've gone with regard to just having the information available to us. So developing country members have been able to participate in sustainability work in ISO and in other places. So the information is in our countries. Mostly it's with the technocrats and the standards people. And so the problem at the beginning, of course, is to get it to the users and the small producers, who are the ones that export the goods and products into the buying countries. So that's good. However, then now we are confronted with the requirements that the small producers are subjected to, as you have indicated. So there are 2 types. The main ones, which Peter has talked about, is those coming out of the EU and the US, because these are our main buyers. Now, the good thing about these ones, even though they are expensive for our producers to implement, but we know about them in advance, and we have had, over time to get used to them and to prepare and to get ready to implement them. So those ones are not as complicated as the next set, which are those by private standards and newer supply chains. Now, those ones pose a significant problem for small producers in developing countries, mainly because we do not know many times about them in advance. So
give us an example. So you've got a small producer doing coffee, for example.
Rainforest, fair trade, stuff that are things that are just coming up now, which serve a good purpose because they're dealing with child labor, forced labor, workers' rights, stuff like that, which is important. but is not in the mainstream EU legislation and so on and so forth. And those, the ones that are covered by EU legislation, we know are about in advance. And therefore, the small producers are confronted with this. It's many times very expensive to implement them. And then there is an added requirement now that you must also certify, which is, of course, an added cost for the small producer themselves, the farmer, or the group of farmers, because these days the producers are organized in cooperatives and in groups of
So they're having to fulfill conditions in order to be able to call themselves sustainable producers, which
Yes,
sometimes they're not able to do.
And in order for them to transport their goods into the markets that they want to get into.
So are they losing out on markets? Is that the end result? Are producers in low and middle income countries actually not able to then export?
Sometimes they are not able to until they meet the requirements. And sometimes in order for them to meet the requirements, it takes an additional cost. Many of them are not able to meet this cost. So those are the main challenges that they are experiencing, especially with sustainability. And so, yes, the information is in our countries, but we need to build capacity for that information to get to who needs to have it. And then we also need to build capacity for the farmers and farmer groups to be able to implement the requirements. And it's a lot easier for the ones coming out of Brussels and other places, because then there's systems already established in many of our countries for the small producers to be able to meet the requirements. But for the private standards and other new supply chain requirements that they are imposed on the small producers, it's a lot harder.
I think one of the examples that you gave in a previous conversation was Starbucks and the sudden conditions
so it was just
that they suddenly imposed on coffee bean farmers.
Yes, so if Starbucks, for instance, wants to buy coffee from Kenya or from all the eastern and southern countries that are growing coffee, and they would have an additional requirement, for instance, for that the coffee was produced in a sustainable manner, and where the sustainability is defined by them, what children are not, gender, stuff like that, which is important stuff. But if the farmer group didn't know about it in advance, then by the time they're bringing the goods to the market, they're not ready to meet those requirements. And sometimes that can mean that they don't get their coffee into the market of choice.
Thank you for illustrating that. Eric, when it comes to the TBT, what's its perspective in terms of building trust, especially in sustainability claims?
Thank you, Shuli. Yeah, actually the issue, I would put a focus on the issue of trust. And it made me think of yesterday, in the afternoon, in this session that you had on hydrogen. Yeah. There was this question, I don't know if it went from you or from Bob out to the audience, about who would dare to get onto the first plane.
On his plane. Lots of people raised their hands, though.
Yeah, and I was surprised. Many people put their hands up. But I thought the answer from, was his name Bob?
It was Bob Kreiner, from Stralis.
The first flight would be certified. And then everyone was like, okay, so that's fine, so certified. So in a way, you, as consumers, this is extremely important, because if I, as a father, am going to buy a helmet for my daughter who rides, or for my son on the bike, I have no way of seeing, when I look at that helmet, whether it is safe or not. But I will see a label. If it's in Europe or somewhere else, it might have this CE mark in it that makes me know, okay, it meets a certain standard, it is certified, and therefore it is safe. So I think this whole issue of trust in trade is essential, and particularly in the sustainability area. If you think of, I gave the example of airplanes and of helmets, but there are so many different ways of certifying and so many different products that are being certified. It could be about organic, what is not organic.
You see, I think you've hit on a very important issue there, that there are claims being made which make it sound as though something is one thing. I mean, organic doesn't automatically mean sustainable, and there was controversy over the so-called blue tick on tins of tuna, which seemed to suggest that it was sustainably fished, but actually it turned out that could be misleading in some cases. So when it comes to trust, certification is one route to go, but important to build that trust, so that people know that they're getting something which is sustainably produced.
Yes, so I think that is my key point, that unless you have that trust, you have more uncertainty, and trade always falters with uncertainty. So this whole infrastructure that you might have behind it, which is about certification and everything, that the work that goes into it, on which standards are a very important part, because you are certifying to something. And you often don't think of what lies behind that certification. And there it could be an international standard, hopefully it is, where everyone has been around the table and said, okay, if we're thinking about safety, if we're thinking about sustainability, these are the key criteria. Then it goes to another body which then certifies that, and then the consumer thinks, okay, it's fine. So that step from standard to certification is very important. And you made me think, because on your comment before, that there are so many different kinds of certifications, and I think that's part of the problem, that there is confusion. Think of nutritional labeling. There's a big debate at the WTO. In our committee, you asked about TBT. What is the right way to label nutrition? You have so many different kinds of claims. At least for organic, right now there is recognition of Codex standards in this area, or IFOAM standards. So you have a certain convergence there. But when you have emerging issues, and maybe AI will be an area, then is when you have trouble, because you have maybe a fragmentation where many different standards are at the basis, and then how does the certification work?
So is this one of the issues that the WTO is seeing, this fragmentation?
Well, the TBT committee covers any goods in trades. So if you're interested in this, there was a report that came out last week, the World Trade Report, that was looking at environmental issues. And I had a graph here just to remind me, but if you look at the number of notifications or trade concerns with respect to environment over the last 25 years, since 95, they have grown over time. So you see that growing concern with many different types of environmental issues, but within that box there are so many different types. It could be about emissions, carbon footprint, it could be about sustainability. And this doesn't go into what you were talking about, which was the private standards area, which is another big area, but I can come back to that if
yeah, and I actually think private standards is something that we should all discuss at some point. But let me bring in Bill here. So regulatory requirements are on the rise. We heard from Caroline about developing countries and the difficulties they have becoming part of the global value chain. I mean, how difficult is it for small traders and small and medium enterprises to validate sustainability claims?
Thanks, Shirley. And I just want to pick up on what Eric said to begin with, which is the trust. And I think trust is at the centre of effective implementation of regulatory requirements. And it's not just trust between the regulators and the traders, but it's between the public and the private sector. And if we're thinking about cross-border trade for SMEs, the compliance costs are very high. So it's incredibly important for there to be a level playing field, for there to be a recognition of a journey for particularly SMEs and cross-border traders, and particularly women-owned led managed firms, and to be able to enter the market, to be able to achieve the standards required to trade. And there's a number of constraints and challenges that are in place at the moment that they would need to deal with very quickly. And a lot of that is around standards, inspections, becoming non-tariff barriers, and so they need to be in place for community protection. But also they need to be fair, transparent, and predictable. And what we see often in developing countries is that these requirements, these regulatory requirements, become a non-tariff barrier. So it's really important for the public and private sector to be able to work together through the National Trade Facilitation Committees, which is a mandatory requirement under the WTO Trade Facilitation Agreement. So again, it's not a consumer standard agreement, but it is actually. It has applicability across all of cross-border trade transactions, including those relating to sustainability, environmental standards. And in the environmental side, it's not just about emissions at the border, which is important, but it's, it includes trade in endangered species, it includes asbestos products, and the like. So again, very important. And finally, the big challenge really is the lack of digitisation and lack of automated process.
And for investors and as well as consumers, and they want sustainability to apply all the way up and down the supply value chain. So what does that mean for, what are the problems then does that pose for trade facilitation?
I mean, global value chains is kind of at one end of the spectrum, and to be able to participate in, say, third country manufacturing inputs as part of a global value chain means exporting your product to a third country for manufacture. You really can only compete if you have an efficient supply chain. And so before you can embark into a global value chain, you need to think about, farm to market. How am I going to get the product, through an efficient process to the border and deal with those regulatory requirements and border clearance issues, and they can be very cumbersome, believe me, and particularly, customs and Ministry of Agriculture quarantine, food safety standards, etc. And if you can't get that to an efficient point, there's no way you can compete to actually enter and participate in the global value chain.
So in terms of building trust, it's important that companies and businesses and producers are following standards, regulatory frameworks, conformity assessment. Let's just dig a little deeper into that. Caroline, with your Casco hat on, what is ISO doing to support the validation and verification process of sustainability claims?
All right, so ISO has been in sustainability for a long time. We have, at the last count, about 100 standards that are dealing with sustainability in various sectors. So sustainability is extremely important to ISO, and we have a lot of subjects with regard to sustainability. So let's look at sustainability in ISO in two fronts. First of all, in ISO technical committees, there are several ISO technical committees that have come up with documents that are to do with sustainability. So the sustainability in very many subjects. Let me highlight two. There is a PC 343 that is looking at a management system for SDGs, the UN SDGs, which is important. It means that it will come up with a document that will help organizations to determine whether they are going towards meeting or complying or addressing the Sustainable Development Goals. And then there are many other standards. One of the ones that is very commonly talked about is the COCO standard. The COCO standard, which is how to produce cocoa in a sustainable manner, and has the standard in 4 parts that gives you the how and how to monitor, and so ISO is right there in the middle to develop documents that have the sustainability. More than a title, it's about the definitions and the hows of how to deal with sustainability. Then there is the work of several technical committees of ISO. The one that is notable is ISO TC 207, which everybody knows is about environmental management systems and has a whole array of documents to deal with efficiency, environmental management systems, life cycle assessment, eco-labeling, which is, of course, what we're talking about, and addressing the issue of greenwashing. So eco-labeling, how this should be done and when. Then we have other technical committees like TC 301 that deals with energy and energy savings, which of course is another technical committee that addresses sustainability issues. However, we have on the other side, so this is the main ISO side, the work of the TCs. But then we do then have Casco standards, which of course is an area that I work with closely as Vice Chair of Casco. And that means we then, as Casco, together with IEC, come up with documents that help to verify, validate, check the sustainability claims. And so that's the value that Casco adds. So Casco, if for instance, an organization claims that their product is recyclable or is biodegradable, then we would provide in Casco a document that helps them to be able to confirm this. So for instance, it would be tested by a lab that is implementing an ISO document, ISO 17025. And so this lab would be able to give an assessment as to the recyclability of the product or the biodegradability.
So you basically confirm whether they're saying is true or not.
So there is a test that's done to confirm, is it really recyclable, is it really biodegradable? If it is a claim to do with, we have a policy, a sustainability policy, and we have a management system that ensures sustainability, then there would be an ISO Casco document, ISO 17021 Part 1, that would then check your management system. And so depending on what it is, if you're saying that you have a process that will ensure that the product that is coming out of the process is organic, then you would be a conformity assessment body that is implementing ISO 17065 would be there to confirm that really you have an organic process. Now, so there are several different standards that we can talk about if you like, but those are just examples to show that ISO Casco has you covered with regard to, can we confirm that the claim that you're making is actually true? The other thing that is important about ISO Casco is the fact that ISO Casco then provides an extra layer of assurance, because all the conformity assessment bodies that I've described, the test lab, the certification body, would be subject to accreditation. And so then there is the extra layer that says, yes, this person from a conformity assessment body has come and confirmed that my product is biodegradable. Why should I believe them? You should believe them because they are accredited by an accreditation body that has so there is an extra layer of assurance that is provided by accreditation.
Particularly for consumers. So accreditation, certification, and I want to pick up on one thing you mentioned there, this issue of greenwashing, which is a huge issue today. And Eric, maybe this is something you can address in terms of the legal and regulatory frameworks, standards, conformity assessment. This is the quality infrastructure which is designed to build trust and presumably to counteract greenwashing.
Yeah, so that's a good point. I mean, stepping back, because Bill, you mentioned NTMs and then there's this notion of barriers to trade and unnecessary barriers to trade. One thing I would want to make clear is that, of course, governments have the right to regulate. That has to be stressed. So, and standards help them regulate in a good way, and that regulation might impede trade, and that's fine. If you have a good reason for that, that should be the way it is. So you want to regulate to make sure that products are safe or of good quality. You don't want to regulate everything, and that's a bit the idea of good regulatory practices. But one should not have the notion that from a WTO point of view, you cannot create barriers to trade. You are allowed to it, but it matters what you do. What you should not be doing is creating unnecessary barriers to trade. But that's the dilemma, because no one has defined what an unnecessary barrier to trade is. And you will always have friction between countries on that issue.
But presumably if countries, because I know the TBT strongly encourage members to use international standards. I mean, surely that helps with sustainability claims.
You should work for WTO. I was coming to that point, because one of the ways of making sure that the barrier is not unnecessary is by basing it on an international standard. And actually that's written into these agreements that cover both food safety and other quality issues, that one should use an international standard. So I think that I wanted to make that point clear to begin with. Then in terms of the WTO briefly and our role, it's a bit of a struggle here, because the WTO is it's a legal, we draft rules for trade, but we don't have projects. It's not like the World Bank or other institutes that have major funds to develop this kind of infrastructure. So although I speak of the importance of quality infrastructure, which Caroline mentioned, the fact that you have functioning standards bodies, that you have accreditation bodies, if not in a country but on a regional basis, that there's a metrology institute, that you have laboratories that are certified, this is invisible but extremely important to create that trust, so that when you're exporting something, an exporter can say, okay, I trust that product. So, but the WTO itself doesn't have the funds to promote that. That's why partnerships with other organizations, whether it's World Bank, UNIDO, or ISO, are extremely important. I'm not sure if I answered your question. I probably lost the thread somewhere.
No. I think you've made it quite clear about how we can build trust in sustainability claims by all the various mechanisms that you've mentioned. How important is it to invest in the QI, in the quality infrastructure, to do that?
I think it's very important, and I think it's very important that is not contracted out.
Yeah.
I think that ability to be able to demonstrate compliance with standards, and actually irrespective of where they come from, because a requirement might be private. For instance, my country, Sweden, has a big company called IKEA that buys a lot of wood because it creates furniture. But if IKEA says that they will only import wood, they will only take from suppliers that have certified to the FSC, Forest Stewardship Council, that's a big consequence on trade, because they are such big buyers and they are using that standard, but it's not a government measure. So there's no place at the WTO, but as a supplier you will be affected by that, and these are the private standards and that one has to think about. One more point. This is not necessarily negative. I think the fact that countries and that you have a wide variety of private standards enables an opportunity to meet them and therefore reach markets. For instance, in Namibia, I think there was a case where they were able, because of the extensive grazing of beef cattle, they could more easily adapt to European standards for animal welfare, because they're not closed in, there's not an intensive farming. So that's an opportunity. So one should not only see private standards as something negative, but also as an opportunity.
That's true.
Bill, I don't know if you want to talk us through how you get companies, and particularly in developing countries, to adopt these sort of common frameworks and standards to facilitate trade.
Yeah, again, it comes down to trust, I think, and the adoption of frameworks that are sensible and can be implemented, in an efficient manner. And, regulation, of course, governments do have the right to regulate, but it's also important to ensure that they're implemented in a fair and transparent manner, and that compliance with standards, compliance with regulation is also respected. And some of the principles that come out of the WTO Trade Facilitation Agreement include trusted trader regimes, which reduces inspections and the burden on SMEs and traders that can demonstrate compliance with regulation and laws. And again, that goes even further for a recognition between countries, looking at the one import being recognised as an export and vice versa, but across borders and between countries. And it's particularly complex. Mutual recognition requires an audit, and it requires compliance assessment, and so again there's a cost to the efficiency. But I think it's really important to ensure that the international community and organisations like ISO, the WTO, the World Bank, the World Customs Organisation, the FAO, actually jointly come together to provide the support for capacity building, particularly for developing countries to adopt these common frameworks.
Because they do need help, don't they, in
Yes, they
actually getting into the supply chain, the value chain.
Yeah, no, very much so, and particularly when it comes to being able to demonstrate compliance with standards. Often that requires an inspection, it requires a lab test. So, for every country in the world to have its own lab doesn't make sense. And so looking at the solutions to adopt a regional approach to compliance through the sharing of not only data, digitisation techniques, exchanging data, and sharing laboratories. And I'd like to pick up on what Peter said right at the beginning. A way to do that is actually through some of the regionally based free trade agreements, like the Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement. It's an ideal mechanism that allows for a commonality of approach in an efficient manner to share both resources, data, digitisation techniques, and a reduction in non-tariff barriers and manual processes which are cumbersome and increase the cost for the private sector. So again, that's back to the partnership between the public and private sectors, which is the answer, both for standards, both for conformity assessment, both for efficient movement of trade and goods and services, of course, across borders.
Peter, just take us through what you want to see from standards community, international organisations, governments. What more should they be doing?
I think they're doing a huge amount already. You've heard from this panel what they're doing, firstly, but also what the constraints are. Thinking about the WTO, its mandate, its resource constraints, etc. I don't know the ISO particularly well, but my sense is it's working very hard on many different standards. And I think that's the point, is there are so many value chains, so many industries, so many services, by the way, out there, all of these connected through value chains, that it's impossible for multilateral organizations to cover all of it. So they have to be selective, they have to focus on those that are most consequential. And then when it comes to the free trade agreements or even the unilateral level, and certainly the private standards as well, gaps can be filled and innovations can be made. And where innovations are made usefully in a free trade agreement, for instance, those should be taken into a multilateral process and hopefully globalized if they are sufficiently consequential. But just quickly on the private standards, I think for me, the way I've always thought about this is that they're driven mostly by lead firms in value chains, typically Western multinationals, but not only. Increasingly, there's many multinationals from other parts of the world. Those multinationals themselves subscribe to a range of ISO standards, so they're already complying with global standards. What they're doing through these voluntary standards is upping the ante in certain areas in ways that suit their consumers, their customers, and that they're responding to customer needs. It is challenging from an SME standpoint. That's where capacity building becomes so important. But you're either going to be locked out of the value chain, or if you can meet the standard, you're going to be locked into the value chain. And that could be a very good outcome for an SME. So it's complicated.
Well, you've all mentioned private standards, so let's talk a little bit about them. Are these helpful to the process? I mean, I suppose fair trade is one private standard that we're all aware of. You probably know a lot of others. What are all your views on private standards? As Peter said, you could be locked out of the supply chain. I don't know how ISO works with private standards. What are some comments that you'd like to make on private? Do you want to say something?
Can I go first? Okay. So for us, in developing countries, of course, we hope that the private, these additional requirements would be in international standards. But over time, we have realized that that's not the case because the interests are very different. And as Peter has said, they are there to serve a specific clientele of the people who are creating them or the supply chains. So we've sort of like given up on them getting into mainstream ISO and being part of the international standardization.
So just from my understanding, is it possible to comply with a private standard that's been set by some consortia or industry and not be ISO compliant? Is that possible or not?
Generally, they are an addition. As Peter has said, they are over and above. So there are additional requirements that the private standards
specific to that industry.
Yeah, but then I would like, as a way of proposing a solution, is that perhaps the supply chains should take responsibility for making sure that the people who supply them the product meet the standards. So let me give the example that Eric gave, where he said the farmers, the cattle farmers in Namibia, or maybe some cattle farmers in Kenya, want to sell leather to Europe, and they are confronted with some more stringent requirements that are sustainability in nature. It is my opinion that it is in the interest of the person, the big buyer, to make sure that they are getting the correct, what they need with regard to requirements. So if it's animal welfare, and they're saying that they would like to be sure that the animals that give the leather were treated in
humanely and gently.
Humanely,
yes.
gently, etc., etc. And they discover that the people that they want to get leather from Kenya or Namibia, they can then take it upon themselves to make sure that their suppliers are meeting the requirements. It is a cost to them. However, I think that it is a cost they should be willing to take, because if it is discovered that they bought leather from farmers that do not treat animals humanely, then it is a dent on their reputation. And because of that, they have a stake in making sure that the people they buy from actually meet. So even with the wood example that you gave for IKEA, then IKEA would then take some cost. And I'm sure it's a small cost compared to the damage to their reputation if it was discovered that they bought wood from a forest that was not
wasn't sustainable.
Yeah, so I think the solution, of course, the normal traditional way we in developing countries have got support is through donor funding and partnership with others, and we are grateful for that, and we hope that we can still get more where it's available. However, I would like to propose another way in which we can make sure that sustainability is achieved without causing distress to the developing country producers and other people, that the supply chains, the private supply chains can actually take up some of the costs of building capacity in the countries that they are buying the supplies from, and making sure that the farmers are treating the animals humanely, that they're able to demonstrate this, making sure that the food that they are buying, for instance, for the big supermarkets in Europe, is actually grown in a sustainable manner. That then becomes their responsibility, and for them it makes sure that they are getting what they want, but also protecting their own brand and their own reputation.
So that could be a proactive step that they take. Eric or Bill, do you have a view on private standards? Do they work well with international standards, or are they another hurdle that traders have to and companies have to take into account?
They can definitely be a challenge and a hurdle, but at the same time, it's comes back to that efficiency of the partnership between the public and private sector, and if it makes sense, and can increase global trade, can increase access to those regional and global markets for SMEs. The private sector companies, like IKEA and the like, and the big supermarkets in Europe, they have the ability to be able to invest, and they can invest in developing countries to actually ensure that they can develop the industry, develop the sector, and participate in both an efficient supply chain, and then move forward to participation in the global value chains. And it can only be good for all.
Yeah, maybe a very brief small comment. And in a sense, it doesn't, for me, the main issue is how the standard was set. So whether it's governmental or private or something in between, it matters how the standard was set. And
isn't it? Aren't they normally set to what the consumer wants? Because presumably the company would bring in a standard which they think would appeal to more consumers, and therefore make them buy more product.
But now you're talking about what you want to achieve with the standard, but how it is set, by that I mean...
But it's a win-win, because consumers do want more sustainability.
Yes, consumers should be part of the process for sure, but you want to have also other stakeholders. So did you have a wide range of stakeholders involved in setting the standard? Were developing countries there? Or those who have expert interests there? Was this open? Have you used the latest scientific information, etc.? That matters. And I think the more you respect some existing principles, which exist both within the WTO and in the 6 principles set by the committee, that helps make the standard more legitimate, so to speak, whether it's set by the private sector or by an international organization like that.
Maybe next time we should have someone from the private sector here involved in making private standards and see how their process works. Do you have any other comments to make on that?
Just one observation on that, and maybe using a current example, which is the case of palm oil in relation to the EU's Sustainable Forestry Directive. So my understanding of the EU's directive is that illegally cleared land after 2020, those products from that land will be banned from importation into the EU. What the EU's directive doesn't recognise is the palm oil standard, the private sector standard. I forget the exact name of it. I think it's ISPO. But that was forged between Unilever, which is the main palm oil importer, the World Wildlife Fund, and now includes 5,000 people different organisations that have signed up to it. And the purpose of the standard is to help smallholder producers in Indonesia, Malaysia, etc. And so they have a whole set of things that the smallholder producers must meet in order to export palm oil to the EU. Now, I would say that's a positive development, given all the issues around land clearance, etc., associated with palm oil, but currently it falls outside of the EU's directive net. So the next stage must be to somehow incorporate it. So there's a private sustainability standard potentially playing a positive role.
So is that the private standard leading the way that will otherwise be hopefully followed by international standards? Thank you very much indeed for your comments there. I think that we've got a lot to talk about. Should we take some questions from the audience? Has anyone got? If you do have a question, please raise your hand. I'm hoping that the lights will dim a little bit because I can't actually see any of you. There we go. Thank you so much. Yes, any questions from the audience? Gentleman here, fourth row. Just wait till the microphone gets to you, and if you wouldn't mind standing up when you get it.
Nice to see them.
Thank you. I was going to say the people with the microphones are going to be very fit by the end of this, up and down the stairs.
Thank you very much. Look, that was an absolutely brilliant presentation. Just want to make a statement. So about 65% of global land surface is forest, and there's no ISO standard for sustainable forest management. However, we've got a cracking Australian standard we'd be quite happy to share with you if you're looking for a template. But anyhow, look, apart from that, probably, Eric, a question for you regarding the role of private standards and technical barriers to trade. So the case of IKEA, Australian supply chains are totally excluded from IKEA because we sit within the PEFC system, not the FSC system. And in my opinion, they're being probably misused in many cases. So thanks.
Thank you very much. Eric, do you want to take that?
First, I should stress I don't work for IKEA. I'm not promoting IKEA as such, although it's a Swedish company. Actually, it's a difficult one because I know from my own parents, they have some forest, and actually they have to choose between the PEFC system, which you mentioned, and the FSC system. But this is a choice by each private forestry owner which kind of certification they want to use. It is not particularly relevant to the WTO because it is not a government-led system. It would be different if I took another country where I live, Switzerland. If Switzerland said from tomorrow, if you're going to import any wood into Switzerland, including to the IKEA companies that are there, you have to use the FSC standard. Then it suddenly becomes what you call the technical regulation because it's become mandatory, and there's the hand of government behind it. And then that would trigger a whole range of other kind of disciplines. Is it transparent? How was the standard set? Is it discriminatory? Are you keeping others out, etc.? But what the private sector does on the side is something that is not, in that sense, directly relevant to the WTO. But I'm making it very black and white. Of course, there's a range of issues.
Thank you. Thank you for the question. I've got an interesting one here coming in online, and it's a very simple one, but I think it's quite interesting. Does the current definition of sustainability apply globally? Are we all understanding it the same way? And how do developing countries, how can they be best assisted in understanding and implementing the requirements? Is there a definition of sustainability that we're all adhering to? Peter, maybe this is for you.
I think there are different conceptions of it, but there's the classic Brundtland definition. So it's environmental, social governance. That's got an economic dimension as well. One thing we haven't spoken about here, for instance, is the labour content, the human rights content, which are very important parts of the sustainability equation. and there's lots of standards in that world as well. But we've been focused on the environmental part of the sustainability.
Because I think people automatically assume it just means climate friendly, but it doesn't. There's a whole raft of other
Yes,
factors.
it's a much broader concept. Yeah.
And is that one of the issues, that getting everyone to understand all parts of that definition?
I mean, in this, one of the ones I like that's been coined this week for me is people, planet, prosperity. I like that one. I know it says social, economic, and environmental, but I like people, planet, prosperity.
Planet.
People, social, planet, environment,
That's
prosperity, economic. I like that one because it in your mind you're already seeing that it's more than just environment, is
all
climate
interconnected.
change, everything is interconnected. So I like that one, and that's one I'm going to use when I get back home. People, planet, prosperity.
Thank you. Another question from the floor. There's a couple near the back there. You might, gentleman in the cap, if you want to stand up. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much to the panel for tackling this very, very interesting topic. My name is Eddie Njoroge from Kenya. And I just want to, first of all, in terms of the question which has just been asked about the international standards, as you are aware, there is the formation of the International Sustainability Standards Board, which is in the process, which is trying to put all the standards together and to be able for the reporting purposes, because this is really where we have had a problem in terms of reporting and the greenwash that you talked about earlier on. But my specific question to the panelists is then on the whole issue of technology and how we are going to use technology to be able to verify the claims, and to what extent that has been used in the past, and what do you foresee the role of technology in terms of verifying?
Yeah, that's a great question, and we haven't actually delved into technology, have we? Does anyone want to take point on that one? Bill, I know technology is something that you're very keen on.
Yes, look, thanks for that question. I think it's a critical one that needs to be thought about very, very carefully. And actually takes us back to Abu Dhabi last year, actually, where we did a panel similar to this with, I think, almost the same participants around digitisation and digitalisation. And it has to be, I guess, based on global standards as well. Like if you were to connect the public sector agencies, so the standards agencies, with customs, with the Ministry of Agriculture and Quarantine, to certify, validate, and share information, it needs to be all based on the same standard as well. And there are a couple of standards out there. The UNECE have a standard for interoperability between systems. The World Customs Organization has the WCO data model, and they allow interoperability through open source platforms. And again, I think that's key for developing countries, is for technology to be developed in an open source platform that's efficient and free for everybody to access. So again, it comes down to the supply chain efficiency, exchange of data, and recognition of data between countries and across border agencies, and a whole of government approach to the regulation, the development of standards, the implementation and compliance of standards.
And making technology equitably accessible to all countries, because otherwise some will be left behind if trade becomes completely digitised.
Indeed.
So that's an issue. Another question from the floor. Oh, gosh, loads. Okay, just gentleman in the centre here. Thank you.
Thank you very much. My name's John Henry. I'm from the Consumers Federation of Australia, and I've been involved in setting these type of standards for greenwashing for more than 20 years, so I was very happy to hear what you're talking about. We talked about technology there. Where does the panel see digital product passports going? Because at the moment we're developing an ISO standard on that, which includes a lot of circularity data, and basically, for those who don't know, it's a little bit like the barcode. that's currently on every product. Only in this case it'll include a lot more information. So what's your feeling about that as a solution? Digital product passports.
Interesting. Who would like to take lead on that? Anybody? Anybody? I think you've flummoxed the panel. Well done. Go ahead.
No, we should ask the gentleman who asked the question, I think.
I mean, I think you probably know more about it than...
I was just going to say, this sounds like a question that you know the answer to and we don't. Go on, Eric.
We did have this discussion about digital products last year, as you were mentioning, and of course there's a whole range of different challenges that raises. I mean, one issue that I remember came up and that we discussed is that, and this is not about the passport issue, because I don't know enough about that, or maybe it is, but then you'll tell me. But if countries are able to use 3D printing, for instance, and be able to print basically in their garage a product they have brought somewhere else, how do you bring in the whole idea of conformity assessment or product liability, or how are you going to look at that? So the whole challenge changes with this issue of digital technology. And then you have, on the conformity assessment side, a big challenge too. Can one use this more than paper? And maybe you have more to say about that. In terms, do you still need all the paper procedures? Could you not do this digitally? But does that leave some countries behind in terms of their ability to use these systems? So those are the kinds of issues that we have faced and talked about.
Okay, I'm really going for a question that the panel can answer. Over there. Yes, please. Thank you.
Dale Mohammed from GCC Standardization. I want to bring to the panel another aspect, actually, is the arbitration. Now, the arbitration, it comes part of the customer complaint between the customer and supplier. And I think from my previous experience in industry, like there was a customer complaint management standard, ISO. I don't know how far this developed and evolved, but now we were like, when we were in the GCC, sometimes like we're dispatching a 5,000 ton of a certain commodity. It goes to the US or Europe or Far East. So once there is a complaint, once the product or the commodity reaches the destination, so there are lots of parties involved, like the insurance, the ship liners, the customer, and the supplier. So when there is an issue and there are like lots of collateral damage, financial, insurance, I mean, how does this really can be brought into a context of standard? Is there any standard from the WTO, ISO, any other international organization can really uptake this?
Well, let's bring that back to sustainability. When a sustainability claim is made and is found not to be the case, what happens at that point?
So can we begin by talking about it from the conformity assessment side? Then I'll let you. Would you like to do the WTO side first?
Yeah, but this is not really arbitration. But
No.
at the WTO, if you have a trade concern that might arise from this type of issue, where a country is not accessing a market, then they would normally bring that to the WTO. If it's sustainability, it would often come to the TBT committee, and then that could trigger a complaint that goes to this formal and legal dispute settlement, but that's a government-to-government type of issue that would come to the WTO. And so probably it's not exactly an answer to your question.
Okay.
If it is something to do, is it something to do with sustainability? Is it a claim that is being disputed? Like it's a claim that the customer is saying this is not a sustainable product. Is that the issue? Or is it a general?
We're probably getting a little off topic here, though. That's the thing. So maybe it's something we can talk about a little bit later on. And I'm very conscious that we're coming to the end of this session. I think we've had a lot of interest from the audience, and I would like to say that straight after this session, our lovely panelists are going to make themselves available to answer more of your questions in a far more informal setting, which will be in the unplugged corner, which is the seated area next to the Plaza Ballroom entrance. That is pretty much after this session. session at quarter past 3 this afternoon. Let's give our panellists one last opportunity to make a final comment, if you would, on the importance of accountability and sustainability claims. Peter, can I start with you?
Sure. Just an observation on the questions. I think it shows just how complex this world is.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And that makes it, the fact that we can't answer all the questions, right? Because we have a limited view, and that's just the reality. So it's all the more important that organizations like the ISO focus on those that are most consequential at the global level. What those are, that I leave to the ISO and its committees. But it's also very clear, and the last question showed this, that accountability is absolutely essential. And I think we've heard a lot of ideas about how to build accountability. There's various processes and mechanisms that exist already. One thing we didn't really talk about was the reporting, and I think that's a critical side of the equation as well, maybe for the next panel.
Peter, thank you. Caroline.
Thank you, Shirley. It's been a great pleasure for me to participate in this panel. Just to remind us that ISO as an organization has a sound basis for sustainability claims, has the standards, has the methods, has already developed systems that will help organizations, suppliers and importers to actually deal with the issue of greenwashing. And then on top of that, as I said earlier, we then have documents that help with the verifying, the certification and accreditation that then gives the extra layer of assurance for the people who are interested in verifying the sustainability claims that they are true and they can be trusted. So I think the whole issue of trust is important, and the emphasis is that ISO as an organization in its various groups has provided the means for us to verify the claims and to trust the claims that have been verified. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Caroline. Eric.
So I think I would put the focus again on public policy, where sustainability is a key issue. And then since we are here at the ISO, the question is how can you use ISO standards in an effective way to achieve public policy? And I think something that was said by Sergio Mujica, I think yesterday or the day before that, was the importance of setting priorities, because as we've seen, this is such a broad area. And you'll have ISO standards on so many products, agricultural and industrial. So it is very important for countries to focus on what is essential for them and engage in that process of international standard setting, because that will help them then achieve those public policy objectives.
Eric, thank you. Bill.
I think the critical principles that are worth focusing on, particularly for developing countries, is to implement, other global standards, not just around sustainability, but like the Trade Facilitation Agreement. So from a cross-border trade perspective, a whole-of-government approach is absolutely critical to ensure an efficient process for import, export and transit of goods, and recognition of compliance and validation and sharing of data to ensure the sustainability claims can be efficiently measured and reported upon.
Thank you. Thank you very much indeed to all my speakers. You've obviously given the audience a lot of things to think about. And thank you for your questions as well. Really appreciate it. Please give a round of applause to our... Thank you. Oh, and yes. That's great, isn't it? Right, so they will be available in the unplugged corner. Please do go and see them. You all know about this, right? Yeah.